For much of the war, distance had offered a kind of illusion. Civilians read about battles far away, followed lines on maps, and counted time in headlines and casualty lists. The fighting felt terrible, but contained. Something endured by soldiers somewhere else. That illusion did not last. As the war dragged on, it began to press inward into kitchens, factories, schools, and streets. Food grew scarce. Prices rose. Letters arrived with unfamiliar handwriting. Entire neighborhoods reorganized themselves around absence. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the meaning of participation changed. You no longer had to wear a uniform to be part of the war. If you worked in a factory, your labor became strategic. If you bought bread, your choices were political. If you spoke openly, your words could be monitored. If you doubted, you could be labeled dangerous. The war expanded until it touched everything. This was not accidental. Modern war demanded resources on a scale no army could supply on its own. Steel, coal, food, labor, morale, all became essential. Governments learned quickly that winning required not just controlling territory, but organizing society itself. Civilians were not simply supporting the war effort. They were part of it. They worked longer hours, accepted rationing, endured propaganda, absorbed loss, and in many cases they did so under pressure that left little room for dissent. Total war did not just mobilize armies, it mobilized entire populations. And once that happened, there was no clear line between front and home. My name is James, and this is Echoes of the Great War, Episode 7. In this episode, we're turning our attention away from the trenches and toward the societies fighting this war. We'll look at how civilians became targets not always of bullets and shells, but of economic pressure, shortages, and strategic bombing. We'll follow the experience of a woman working in a munitions factory, where the demands of production reshaped daily life and personal identity. We'll examine how governments use propaganda and censorship to maintain support, control information, and define acceptable belief. And finally, we'll explore what happens to societies asked to sustain extraordinary effort for years on end. Because by the middle of the war, victory no longer depended only on what happened at the front. It depended on whether nations could hold together at home. When the war began, most governments insisted on a familiar distinction. Soldiers fought. Civilians endured. That distinction did not survive the demands of total war. World War I required resources on a scale no previous conflict had demanded. Armies needed shells by the millions, uniforms by the tens of millions, food by the ton, and labor everywhere. And because those resources came from civilian life became inseparable from the battlefield. This shift happened gradually. At first, civilians were affected indirectly. Men left for the front. Families adjusted. Industries redirected production. The war pressed outward from the front lines, but it still felt distant for many. Then, pressure increased. Blockades restricted imports. Railways prioritized military transport. Governments redirected food supplies. Prices rose faster than wages. Shortages appeared not as catastrophes, but as daily inconveniences that accumulated into something heavier. Civilians were no longer just supporting the war. They were sustaining it. This made them strategically relevant. On land, artillery and gas aimed to break enemy armies. At sea, submarines targeted shipping to weaken economies. Both approaches shared a logic. If the enemy's capacity to fight could be undermined, victory might follow without decisive battlefield success. Civilians became part of that calculation. The British naval blockade of Germany is a clear example. Britain did not attempt to defeat Germany at sea through direct confrontation alone. Instead, it sought to restrict Germany's access to food, fuel, and raw materials by controlling maritime trade. The blockade tightened steadily. Imports fell. Nutrition declined. Civilian hardship increased. From Britain's perspective, this was strategic pressure, a way to shorten the war by weakening Germany's ability to sustain it. From Germany's perspective, it was collective punishment. The moral ambiguity was unavoidable. Blockades were not new, but their scale and impact were unprecedented. Civilian hunger became an accepted instrument of policy, even as leaders insisted they were targeting systems, not people. The same logic appeared elsewhere. On land, long-range artillery began striking towns behind the front. Zeppelin raids targeted cities in Britain. Rail hubs, factories, and ports became legitimate military objectives, and because civilians lived and worked in those places, they were increasingly exposed to danger. These attacks were often limited in physical effect, but powerful psychologically. They disrupted sleep, created fear, shattered the idea that distance meant safety. War was no longer something happening somewhere else. It could arrive at night. It could arrive without warning. This psychological pressure mattered. Governments understood that morale was as critical as production. A population that lost faith could undermine the war effort more effectively than an enemy army. As a result, civilians were pulled into a contradictory position. They were told they were essential to victory, and they were treated as vulnerable points to be pressured. This contradiction shapes daily life. Civilians were asked to accept rationing, longer hours, and shortages as patriotic duty. At the same time, they were warned of enemy threats and urged to remain vigilant, disciplined, and loyal. Participation was framed as moral obligation. Suffering became proof of commitment. This framing was not universal or uncontested. Strikes occurred, protests erupted, black markets flourished. People adapted in ways both cooperative and resistant. But the underlying shift was irreversible. Modern war could not be fought without reorganizing society. And once society was reorganized, it became a target. Not always deliberately, not always violently, but structurally. This is why the phrase home front matters. It suggests a space that is separate yet connected, a place where civilians are not passive observers, but active participants whose behavior influences outcomes. The home front became a site of strategy. Food consumption mattered. Labor output mattered. Public opinion mattered. Compliance mattered. Governments learned to manage these variables through policy, persuasion, and pressure. And civilians learned that neutrality was no longer an option. You were either contributing or you were a problem. This shift reshaped relationships between states and citizens. Governments expanded authority in ways that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. They regulated markets, controlled information, directed labor, monitored dissent. Many of these measures were justified as temporary necessities. Some would outlast the war. The targeting of civilians did not always involve bombs or bullets. More often, it took the form of systems designed to extract endurance, ration books, work schedules, propaganda campaigns, and surveillance. Violence was present, but so was bureaucracy, and the combination proved powerful. By the middle of the war, civilians were no longer defined by what they were spared. They were defined by what was demanded of them. This transformation did not occur because leaders were unusually cruel. It occurred because modern war required it. And once the logic of total war took hold, there was no clear boundary left to defend. The battlefield had expanded, and everyone was standing on it. When the war began, many women expected disruption. They did not expect transformation. As millions of men left for the front, governments faced an immediate problem. Armies needed shells, rifles, uniforms, and equipment in quantities that dwarfed anything peacetime industry had ever produced. The factories that could supply them were suddenly short of labor. The solution was obvious. Women, across Britain, France, and later other combatant nations, women were recruited into industrial work on an unprecedented scale. Jobs that had once been considered unsuitable, even unthinkable, became not just acceptable, but essential. For many women, the transition was abrupt. 1 month, they were working in domestic service, textile shops, or not employed at all. The next, they were handling explosives, operating heavy machinery, and working 12-hour shifts under strict supervision. In Britain, these women became known as munitionettes. Their work was dangerous. Explosives were unstable. Accidents were common. Fires and detonations could kill dozens in seconds. Even routine exposure carried risks. Chemicals used in shell production stained skin and hair yellow, earning some women the nickname canaries. One British worker later recalled, "You could always tell who worked the shells. Our hands never looked clean. The smell followed you home. The hours were long. Shifts often ran day and night, 6 or 7 days a week. Overtime was expected, not requested. Fatigue was treated as a personal failing rather than a structural problem. And yet, many women took pride in the work. Pay was often higher than what had been available before. Independence, however limited, felt real. For the first time, many women earned their own wages, lived apart from family, and participated directly in what was framed as national survival. This mattered. Governments did not simply hire women. They mobilized them. Propaganda posters portrayed factory workers as soldiers of industry, contributing as directly to victory as men in uniform. Work became patriotic duty. Absence became suspect. Complaints were reframed as selfishness. The message was clear. This was not just a job. It was service. But service came with constraints. Women were expected to be productive, disciplined, and compliant. Unions were tolerated when useful and restricted when inconvenient. Strikes were discouraged or suppressed. Dissent was portrayed as betrayal. The war expanded opportunity and narrowed acceptable behavior. For many women, the factory became a site of contradiction. There was empowerment in earning wages and mastering skilled labor. There was also exhaustion, danger, and constant surveillance. Independence existed within rigid boundaries, and always there was awareness of temporariness. From the beginning, governments insisted this was exceptional, a necessity of war. When peace returned, normal roles would resume. That knowledge hung over everything. Some women embraced the work wholeheartedly. Others endured it grimly. Many did both at once. One French factory worker wrote to her sister, "They tell us we are doing something important. I believe it, but I am so tired, and I wonder who will remember us when this is over." Her question would prove prescient. When the war ended, many women were dismissed from their positions quickly. Men returned. Jobs reverted. The industrial world that had opened itself to women closed again, often abruptly, and without apology. The contribution was praised. The independence was revoked. And yet, something had shifted. Women had demonstrated that they could perform industrial labor under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They had organized production, maintained discipline, and kept armies supplied under constant strain. That knowledge did not disappear. The munitions factory reveals something essential about total war. It did not simply expand the battlefield. It rearranged society. It pulled people into roles they had not chosen, and then asked them to perform as if those roles were natural. It rewarded sacrifice while denying permanence. It created new identities: worker, contributor, patriot, and then dissolved them when they were no longer convenient. For the women who lived it, the experience lingered in damaged health, in altered expectations, in memories of work that mattered deeply and was quickly forgotten. Total war demanded everything. And when it was done, it rarely gave back proportionally. As civilian life became central to the war effort, governments faced a problem that could not be solved with factories or weapons. They needed belief, not enthusiasm that faded quickly. Belief. People had to accept shortages, loss, danger, and uncertainty, not as failure, but as necessity. They had to continue working, consuming less, and trusting leaders even as the war dragged on far longer than promised. This is where propaganda entered the war, not as a crude tool of lies, but as a system of narrative control. Before the war, governments had rarely attempted to shape public opinion on such a scale. Newspapers were partisan but independent. Information flowed unevenly. Doubt existed openly. Total war changed that. Information became a resource. And like any resource, it had to be managed. Governments began by emphasizing unity. Early propaganda stressed shared purpose, national identity, and moral clarity. Posters depicted soldiers as protectors and civilians as contributors. The war was framed as defensive, righteous, and unavoidable. These messages were not entirely false, but they were selective. Casualty figures were delayed or softened. Defeats were reframed as strategic withdrawals. Setbacks became temporary challenges on the road to inevitable success. This was not always centrally coordinated at first. Over time, however, propaganda became institutionalized. Britain established the War Propaganda Bureau. France expanded censorship offices. Germany centralized press control under military authority. The goal was not just to persuade, it was to prevent demoralization. Censorship played a critical role. Letters from the front were monitored. Newspapers were restricted in what they could print. Photographs were curated carefully. The home front saw the war as governments wanted it seen grim, but controlled, dangerous, but purposeful. This mattered because doubt was contagious. Governments feared that if people began to question the war openly, morale would collapse, production would fall, discipline would erode, protests might spread. So doubt itself became suspect. Criticism could be framed as weakness, dissent as disloyalty, pacifism as betrayal. The line between persuasion and coercion blurred. This pressure did not fall evenly. Working class communities bore shortages more acutely. Minority groups faced suspicion. Immigrants were scrutinized. Political radicals were monitored or imprisoned. In many countries, emergency laws expanded state power dramatically. Meetings were restricted, publications banned. Speech criminalized under broad definitions of national security. These measures were justified as temporary. But while the war lasted, they reshaped relationships between governments and citizens. The state no longer simply governed. It managed perception. Propaganda also evolved in tone. As the war dragged on, early optimism gave way to appeals to endurance. Victory was no longer imminent. Sacrifice became the message. Posters urged people to save food, buy war bonds, work harder, and complain less. Images emphasized suffering soldiers who depended on civilian effort. Guilt became a motivator. So did fear. Enemy atrocities were highlighted relentlessly. Stories, some true, some exaggerated, circulated widely. The enemy was portrayed not just as hostile, but as morally alien. This framing helped sustain commitment, but it also narrowed the space for empathy or compromise. Once the enemy was depicted as irredeemable, negotiation became unthinkable. Propaganda locked societies into a moral posture that made backing down politically impossible. This had long-term consequences. When peace finally came, populations conditioned for total commitment struggled to accept limited outcomes. Compromise felt like betrayal. Loss felt unjustified. Propaganda had succeeded too well. It had mobilized belief, but it had also hardened expectations. There is a temptation to view wartime propaganda cynically as manipulation imposed from above on passive populations. That picture is incomplete. People participated. They repeated slogans, displayed posters, policed one another's behavior, internalized narratives because those narratives gave meaning to suffering. Belief was not forced entirely. It was shared. This is what made propaganda powerful. It did not merely suppress doubt. It replaced it. By the middle years of the war, the home front was not just producing weapons. It was producing conviction. And conviction became another resource the state learned to exploit. The cost was subtle but profound. Trust became conditional. Truth became strategic. And the habit of questioning authority weakened under the weight of emergency. Total war required unity. Propaganda provided it, but it did so by reshaping the relationship between citizens and the truth itself. Wartime messaging did not emerge fully formed. It was built deliberately, tested constantly, and adjusted when it failed. Governments learned quickly. that slogans alone were not enough. People did not need to be told simply that the war mattered. They needed to be shown how their daily behavior connected to outcomes they could imagine. So messaging became specific. In Britain, posters urged citizens to save bread, dig for victory, and buy war bonds. These were not abstract appeals to patriotism. They linked individual actions, skipping a meal, investing savings, growing vegetables to soldiers at the front. The implication was subtle but powerful. If you did not comply, you were not just careless. You were responsible. France followed a similar path. Government messaging emphasized endurance and sacrifice, portraying civilians as the backbone of national resistance. Posters showed women working, children helping, families persevering. The home front was framed as morally equal to the battlefield. Germany, under blockade and increasing strain, relied even more heavily on messaging that emphasized unity and resilience. Scarcity was framed as proof of enemy cruelty rather than state failure. Hunger became a symbol of national suffering rather than a policy problem. In all cases, messaging worked by simplifying causation. Complex economic and military realities were reduced to clear narratives. We are strong because we endure. We suffer because the enemy is brutal. Victory depends on your behavior. This clarity was essential. Ambiguity breeds doubt. Governments avoided it wherever possible. One of the most effective tools was personalization. Posters and pamphlets often featured individual soldiers addressing civilians, directly pointing, staring, appealing. The message was intimate. He is watching you. He needs you. This technique collapsed distance between front and home. It made abstract sacrifice immediate and relational. Messaging also relied heavily on repetition. The same themes appeared everywhere in newspapers, posters, school lessons, factory walls, church sermons. You did not need to seek propaganda. It found you. Over time, this saturation normalized expectations. Long hours, rationing, and compliance stopped feeling exceptional. They became baseline behavior. Dissent, by contrast, became visible. Someone who complained stood out. Someone who questioned messaging disrupted the rhythm. Social pressure did much of the enforcement work the state could not do openly. This was not always heavy-handed. Often it was quiet. A neighbor noticing your food choices. A supervisor questioning your enthusiasm. A newspaper editorial framing criticism as selfish. Government messaging succeeded in part because it enlisted the public as its own enforcers. But this system had limits. As shortages worsened and casualties mounted, messaging strained credibility. Promises of victory rang hollow. Appeals to sacrifice collided with exhaustion. Governments adjusted tone accordingly. By the later years of the war, messaging shifted from optimism to endurance. Posters no longer promised quick success. They acknowledged hardship while insisting it was still necessary. The goal was no longer enthusiasm. It was compliance. This distinction matters. Propaganda is often imagined as emotional manipulation, but its most effective form during World War I was managerial. It organized expectations, regulated behavior, and maintained functionality under strain. It did not need everyone to believe deeply. It needed most people to keep going. And for a time, it worked, but the costs lingered. When peace came, populations accustomed to controlled narratives struggled to reorient. Trust in official information was uneven. Cynicism coexisted with lingering belief. Governments, having learned how effective messaging could be, were reluctant to abandon those tools entirely. The war had shown that managing perception was not an accessory to power. It was power. And once that lesson was learned, it could not be unlearned. By the middle years of the war, endurance itself had become a problem. Total war asked societies not just to mobilize, but to sustain extraordinary effort indefinitely, and that demand carried consequences no amount of propaganda could fully absorb. Shortages worsened. Food became scarcer. Fuel was rationed. Housing deteriorated as maintenance lagged, and materials were redirected to the war effort. In many cities, queues for basic goods stretched for hours. The daily rhythm of life reorganized itself around scarcity. This pressure was uneven. Working-class families felt it first and hardest. Wages struggled to keep pace with inflation. Women juggling factory work and household responsibilities carried double burdens. Children left school early to contribute income or labor. Patriotism did not put food on the table. Morale frayed quietly. Outwardly, societies appeared resilient. Production continued. Governments functioned. Public displays of unity persisted. But beneath that surface, fatigue accumulated. Strikes broke out across Europe, not always as protests against the war itself, but against conditions made intolerable by it. Workers demanded higher wages, shorter hours, better food rations. Authorities often responded cautiously at first, recognizing that repression carried risks. But patience had limits. Emergency powers expanded. Police surveillance increased. Labor unrest was reframed as subversion. Political radicals were monitored, arrested, or silenced. The war blurred the boundary between maintaining order and suppressing dissent. This tension played out within families as well. Letters from the front became more guarded as censorship tightened. Soldiers reassured loved ones even as they suffered. Civilians downplayed hardship to avoid burdening those fighting. Truth fractured into fragments, shared selectively. Everyone knew things were bad. Few said it openly. This silence carried psychological cost. Grief compounded as casualty lists lengthened. Loss became routine and therefore harder to process. Mourning was compressed into brief moments before daily demands reasserted themselves. Communities adapted rituals accordingly. Public memorials multiplied. Private grief retreated behind stoicism. The war did not allow time to heal. Social divisions widened. Those perceived as benefiting from the war, industrialists, black marketeers, officials became objects of resentment. Class tension sharpened. In some countries, ethnic and religious minorities faced suspicion, blamed for shortages or defeatism. Unity fractured along fault lines that propaganda could mask but not erase. Governments faced a dilemma. The war still required total commitment, but the social fabric sustaining that commitment was thinning. Leaders oscillated between concession and coercion, between reforms meant to ease strain and crackdowns meant to restore discipline. Neither approach solved the underlying problem. The war had become longer than anyone planned and more demanding than anyone admitted. This strain did not produce immediate collapse everywhere, but it created conditions in which collapse became possible. Exhaustion eroded legitimacy. Repeated sacrifice without visible progress weakened trust. The gap between official narratives and lived experience grew harder to ignore. By 1916, many societies were still functioning, but functioning under tension. Total war had proven that modern states could mobilize entire populations. It had not proven they could do so indefinitely. The home front did not break all at once. It bent, and in that bending, the seeds of later crises were planted crises that would erupt unevenly, unpredictably, and with consequences that reached far beyond the war itself. This strain would matter, not immediately, but soon. In this episode, we followed the war away from the front lines and into everyday life. And in doing so, we saw how completely World War I reshaped the societies fighting it. We watched civilians become targets not always of bombs or shells, but of pressure, scarcity, and strategic calculation. Blockades, shortages, and long-range attacks turned daily life into part of the conflict, collapsing the boundary between battlefield and home. We stepped inside a munitions factory and saw what total war demanded of those asked to sustain it. Long hours, dangerous work, and a sense of purpose that existed alongside exhaustion and uncertainty. The war opened new roles and possibilities, even as it insisted they were temporary. We examined how governments learned to manage belief itself using propaganda, censorship, and social pressure to maintain cohesion when enthusiasm faded. Messaging simplified reality, narrowed acceptable doubt, and bound sacrifice to moral obligation. And finally, we saw the strain that followed. Not sudden collapse, but slow bending, fatigue, resentment, grief carried quietly. Society's still functioning, but under tension that could not be sustained forever. What emerges from the home front is a deeper understanding of total war. It was not only about defeating enemy armies, it was about organizing endurance and discovering its limits. As the war moved into its later years, those limits would matter as much as any battlefield outcome. Pressure at home would shape decisions at the front, and internal weakness would become as dangerous as external threat. In the next episode, we return to the Western Front, to two battles that came to define the war's middle phase. Verdun and the Somme. We'll examine why these battles were fought, what commanders believed they could achieve, and how the logic of endurance replaced the hope of breakthrough. We'll slow down moments measured not in days, but in hours, and ask what it meant to fight for ground measured in yards, at costs measured in lives. That's next time on Echoes of the Great War.
Thank you for listening to Echoes of the Great War. If you'd like to learn more about the Great War, we recommend reading The Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark and The First World War by Hugh Strachan. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment and share us with others. And to be the first to know when new episodes and seasons are released, you can follow the show on your preferred podcast platform and on social media by searching for Echoes of War Pod.